Our first guest has long been known for tending towards bipartisanship. Democratic Senator Jean Shaheen, a former New Hampshire governor, is now ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And she joined me from Washington. Senator Jean Shaheen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So I know there are lots of meetings. I suppose there are attempts by all sides to reverse this shutdown, but you voted for it. Why? Why to shut the government down?
I'm very concerned about making sure that people in America can continue to get access to health care at a cost they can afford. I've been working hard to try and ensure that the tax credits, the subsidies that help people afford their health insurance do not end in December, and that people are not facing a doubling of their insurance rates, which is what is being anticipated. So I think this is something that we ought to be able to reach agreement around. I'm continuing to talk to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle about how we continue to move this discussion forward. We should be able to keep the government open and ensure that people have access to health care at the same time.
So let me ask you this. Do you think, though, it's a bit risky on a number of issues? One, it appears that you as a Democrat are, making this line in the sand on a policy issue, and that is health care. But the other party can blame you. And then the other party can also do, as Trump said himself, the president, sometimes shutdowns are good. I wonder whether you understand what he meant by that.
Well, my understanding is that the White House has been back and forth, and the president has been back and forth on wanting a shutdown or not wanting a shutdown. But the reality is the Republicans control all three branches of government. They control the White House, they control both houses of Congress, and many would say they control the Supreme Court. So I think ultimately people will question why, given that, they have not been able to avoid a shutdown. And I think the reason is because there was an unwillingness to talk to Democrats about where we could come together to keep the government open and address the issues around health insurance, which are very real for Republicans as well. We've had President Trump's own pollsters, two of them, come out and say if the GOP doesn't address the rising costs for insurance rates that are going to happen if we don't extend these tax credits, that they will pay at the polling booth next year. So I think it's in everybody's interest to get a resolution. We need to talk to each other, because unless we're talking to each other, we're not going to get this resolved.
Now, the White House still welcomes it. Basically, President Trump says he'll use the shutdown to, quote, fire federal workers specifically targeting Democrats and to cut programs Democrats like. So again, do you worry about that and about playing into their game, which is to, quote unquote, dismantle the administrative state? That comes from Project 2025.
Well, of course I worry about it. I worry about the fact that President Trump has been doing this from the day that he took office and started eliminating the U.S. Agency for International Development and cutting all foreign assistance and riffing workers at the Department of Agriculture, at the Department of Veterans Affairs, at virtually every department within the federal government in a way that really affects my constituents and their ability to access services. So, of course, I'm worried about this. I think it's an issue that is going to come home to roost for the president, because ultimately he's in charge. His party is in charge of Congress and the White House. And he ultimately is responsible if people aren't talking to each other, if we're not working this out. And it's unfortunate that he refused to meet with Democratic leadership earlier, and Republican leadership for that matter, that he listened to partisan concerns and said, we're not going to talk. Don't talk. You Republicans in Congress don't talk to Democrats. That's not how we get a resolution. The way you get a resolution is to figure out ways in which we can come to agreement on the concerns on both sides of the aisle. I think there are a lot of us in the Senate and in the House who think that that's what we should be doing now, and we need to get an agreement.
Senator, there are also been things happening, on the edges of this shutdown. For instance, it's not an exaggeration to say a lot of the world, especially allies, were looking at this cryptic email that Hegseth, the defense secretary, sent out to all your military commanders from all over the world to come to Washington. Nobody quite knew what it was going to be. Then President turns up, President Trump. And I just wonder, what was that about? It was a highly political speech. The generals and commanders seemed not to be, you know, cheering and clapping. There was a lot of silence there. What was that all about? And by the way, who's paying that bill for flying them all over the world?
Well, that's a real concern. You know, the United States has the strongest, the most lethal, the best military in the world. And one of the things that has made it so great has been that it's outside of politics, that we look for professionalism in our military. It's one of the arguments I make as I'm talking to new democracies and developing countries around the world, that the important thing is to separate your politics from your military. And all this president has done, and Pete Hegseth has done since they took office, is to try and politicize the military. That is not in America's interest. That does not make a better, more lethal fighting force, and it needs to end.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's going to cost potentially millions and millions of dollars. The president said even more than or $1 billion. He threw that number out. But how does that square?
Yeah. Lost.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem. I think we need to demand in Congress to know where that money's coming from and what they are not doing to ensure that our military is ready, because they spent the money to have this foolish meeting that was nothing but a political pep rally for Donald Trump.
And I have to say, the optics, the pictures were very, frankly, disturbing. When I first saw the picture, I actually didn't know what country I was looking at, because it just looked like a gathering of the military in some of the worst nations. I'm not casting aspersions. I've spent my whole life with the American military, but I'm just saying it looked like they were forced into an uncomfortable situation, and they didn't cheer and whoop. So my question is, do you feel that they have, by their silence, recommitted to being apolitical?
Absolutely. They behaved completely professionally, as we would expect our military to do. You know, that meeting was an embarrassment to the United States and to the professionalism of the men and women who are serving in our military.
And can I ask you also what you made of President Trump saying to that group, because this is also very, relevant to what's going on in your country right now. He basically said, you know, it's the enemy within that we have to be on the watch for. He claims America is, quote, under invasion from within, and that the Pentagon should use American seas as training grounds for the military. Do you understand what he means?
Well, I think the president's delusional when he talks like that. The fact is, there are differences of opinion in this country. That's what our democracy is all about. And what the president should be about is trying to bridge those differences, trying to get people to talk to each other, not trying to whip up differences and to use the military to go into our cities. You know, I remember the 60s when there were riots in our cities across this country. I remember the National Guard being called in to try and put down those disturbances. That is not happening now. It is not happening in Portland, Oregon. It's not happening in Chicago, Illinois. It's not happening in Washington, D.C. And for the president to suggest that he is going to violate the law and use cities as a training ground for our military is just beyond the pale.
And also it comes, obviously, after this very fragile moment in the wake, now a couple of weeks since Charlie Kirk's assassination, and the specter of political violence. I want to ask you also about international affairs. You are the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There seems to be a discussion within the U.S. administration on what to do about Venezuela. So far, there have been what has been described as extrajudicial killings and bombings of small boats for reasons that we don't fully understand, apart from the fact that it's got something to do with drugs, says the administration, but also Are you aware of a conversation about whether the United States should engage in regime change in Venezuela, with some hardliners in the government talking about getting rid of Maduro?
Well, I would certainly like to see Maduro gone. And I think everything we can do to stop drug traffickers is important. My home state of New Hampshire was hit very hard by the opioid epidemic. We are still experiencing the remnants of that in ways that are devastating for families. But if we're going to engage against the cartels, it needs to be done legally according to international law. And I think that's the question that hasn't been answered. And Congress, the Senate Armed Services Committee got a briefing this morning. It was classified, so I'm not going to speak to that, except to say that we didn't get a lot of answers, and there were concerns raised on both sides of the aisle. So I hope that the administration is going to listen to those concerns and is going to provide the documentation that we request.
Do you think the Democrats are doing everything they can to push back on policies that you disagree with? In other words, are you being a strong enough opposition, as is traditional in the United States? Because, you know, the way we see it abroad is that there's very little constitutional authority that's given to the Congress actually being exercised.
Well, I think Democrats are raising concerns every day. I think the challenge is that the Republicans are in charge in both the House, the Senate, and the White House. And so when you don't have the votes, it's very difficult to move policy. That's why trying to get like-minded people to come together to address concerns is really important. And I hope the leadership on both sides of the aisle, in both the House and the Senate, will do that.
Mm-hmm. And can I ask you about the latest, which is President Trump's Gaza proposal? Everybody in the world wants to see the end of this war. There's no doubt about that. Are you convinced that this is the best path forward because there's an out, which basically said unless Hamas accepts within 72 hours, President Trump turned to Netanyahu and said, you can do, I'm paraphrasing, whatever it takes to finish off the war. And Netanyahu himself has said that he never said he agreed with the formation of a Palestinian state.
Well, I think there were a number of provisions in that proposal that were positive. And I think it's positive that a number of the Arab leaders in the region weighed in and talked about the importance of that. We need to see Hamas defeated in Gaza. I hope that they will look at that proposal and agree to return the hostages, agree to stop the conflict so that Israel will stop bombing, that they will recognize that what's in the best interest of the Palestinians is to ensure that they have a future that is without conflict. I think it's positive that President Trump said to Prime Minister Netanyahu, we are not going to accept your going into the West Bank. We need to ensure that the Palestinians can still look to a future. Now, whether that proposal ultimately is what's going to do that, I think remains to be seen. But what we need to do is to ensure that people come together and say there needs to be a future for Palestinians. I think that's a separate Palestinian state, that there needs to be an end to the bombing in Gaza, that we need to see humanitarian aid to help the people in Gaza who are suffering so much. And we all need to come together around that. And I'm disappointed that Prime Minister Netanyahu is still refusing to embrace a future for the Palestinians.
And finally, Senator, you've had a long political career. You've been governor, you've been senator. You plan to retire from the Senate in 2026. With the tightness of, of your political position in terms of a party, why have you decided that this is the right time? And I know you talk about a new generation and, how long you've been at it. But in terms of the moment,
it's more about my personal situation and wanting to be able to have some time to do some other things for the rest of my life. I'm hoping to have some more good years with my husband, who is retired, with my family. And so this was the right time for me. I will have served in elective office for 30 years at the end of my term. I will have been involved in politics over 50 years. And so it's time to think about other ways that I can contribute. All right. And I hope to continue to be involved.
One last question, and that's perfectly understandable. You have been known for trying to forge, and often forging, a path towards bipartisan consensus. This is really difficult, I understand, right now. What do you think by the time you retire, you might be able to, the sands might shift a little bit? What do you think about the prospect of bipartisanship?
Well, I think we have to keep at it, and we can't throw up our hands and say we aren't going to talk to each other. That's why we're in a government shutdown, is because we've refused to talk to each other. And I think in order to make that happen, each of us has to say, we're going to try and figure out how we can move a bipartisan agenda along. That's why I've worked so closely with the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Jim Risch. He and I don't agree on a lot of things, but one of the things we do agree on is that it's important to have bipartisan foreign policy and to try and work together in ways to move that agenda forward. So I think it may take some time before we see the end of the partisan cycle that we're in. But one of the things we know about our democracy is what goes around comes around. And there is going to be another election. And I believe another election after that, because I think that's what the American people want. And that we need to be thoughtful about how we address our colleagues, and they should be thoughtful about how they address us, because in the next term, the Democrats may be in charge.
Interesting. And I know I'm going to let you go now, but how long do you think this shutdown is going to last? I know you're running back and forth with votes and trying to deal with this.
Well, I think we should try and do everything possible to get the government open as soon as possible. We never should have been in this position, as I've said. There's no reason why we can't keep the government open and address the health care needs of the American people. That's what we all should be supporting. And we can have our disagreements, but we need to be acting in the best interest of the American people.
Senator Jean Shaheen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.